making or helping our students to attain. I'm pretty sure that it's similar in other countries as well. So in our standards, our new standards, they're organized into 3 dimensions. The first dimension is the disciplinary core ideas. So that's, again, the content, the physics, the biology, the chemistry, all of those concepts that students are supposed to know by the end of the 12th grade. The next is the science and engineering practices. So that is how science is done, the investigations, the inquiry. But what is new, and it wasn't before, is that now there are engineering practices. So also how engineers go about their work. And then the last one is the cross-cutting concepts. So those are the concepts that go across all content and all of the practices. So those are common to every kind of science. So the second 2 dimensions, the science and engineering practices, as well as the cross-cutting concepts, contain ideas about nature of science and scientific inquiry. What's missing in our next generation science standards this go-around is any mention of the nature of science, unless you look at our one of the last appendices, it's Appendix H. There was sort of an outcry from the science education community in the U.S. that nature of science was missing, despite all the research that says it's important. It was missing, and so it was added later on. So you have to kind of look for it in there, and then if you can't find it, look at Appendix H. There's been added a chapter. So, and I just mentioned, despite all the current research, so we have the students' understandings of nature of science and scientific inquiry, and then how they together support the attainment of scientific literacy, so that part of it remain as adequate as they have been since the 1960s. And so when I say that, that doesn't mean it's a good thing. That means they're still inadequate. So despite all the research that says in the past 4 to 5 decades that indicates that students and teachers learning about the nature of science should be conducted and taken care of through explicit reflective instruction, it's still not in very, very little bit in the classroom and not really in the curricula. About 6 years ago, I went on sabbatical. So I had been an elementary teacher in my career before I was a professor, but I went on sabbatical and became an elementary teacher again because I knew that I was trying to help my students, my pre-service teachers, understand how to teach about the nature of science and understand how to assess whether or not their students could attain that. So I became a teacher, taught all the subjects, even math, and I also taught science and tried to embed nature of science in there. What I clearly found was that there was no mention of nature of science in the curriculum, and it took a lot of work on my part to make it connected. So this is probably a big reason in my mind why it's not being taught, is because it takes a lot of effort. And I have to be honest, I did not make that much effort, the same kind of effort in the other subject areas, which I know they were also very important. So it's hard for a teacher to make those connections if the curriculum doesn't support it. And some of my Turkish students helped me on that study too. We're still analyzing some of that data in terms of student learning. So anyway, that study did help me know that students could learn it, but that it was very difficult to teach it. But now we have our new standards talking about not only about the nature of science, but we also have to include connections to technology. We need to include engineering, and we need to include mathematics. So we, as teacher educators, then need to help the teachers understand how to teach about STEM. So that's a new requirement. But the problem is teachers are still struggling not only how to teach about the nature of science, but really how to understand about the nature of science. So they still, a lot of teachers don't understand it, and that means they can't teach it. And even if they do try to teach it, the effort has to be very great to embed it into the curriculum. So this means now that we're adding the TEN, we even have a more difficult job to help them, prepare them to do what they need to do. So I thought, in my mind, if I know about the nature of science because I've been studying it for 17 years, I wonder about the other disciplines, because it seems like STEM, the S, I know about a lot, but I don't really know a lot about the 10 part. And I'm still supposed to prepare my teachers. So I was thinking I would do a search on the nature of the T and the E and the M, and then see how it connects to science. So I did a search just the way any average person could do a search. So I don't know if I found the pivotal documents in the other disciplines or what they would consider most accurate. But what I did find, what was most accessible. So I'm going to share those with you, and if there's anyone in the audience that disagrees or has other insights to add, that is great, because this is just what I was able to find. So this nature of the T, the nature of technology, I found in a book by Arthur in 2014, and it was a whole book called The Nature of Technology. So I pulled out some pieces that I thought were the most poignant. So first, he said that technologies are a combination of elements, so things that were already created. And the elements themselves are technology. So it's sort of like the little pieces that are inside your phone. Those are technology, and it makes your phone a bigger technology. And then all the technologies use some phenomenon to a purpose. So we don't have any technology unless there's a purpose for it. He also indicated 3 different meanings of technology. One was individual technology. So it's a means to fulfill a human purpose. So if there's a purpose, then technology will be created by humans who create the technology to fulfill that purpose. The second are the bodies of technologies, like the little semiconductors, robots, or those little things, even this computer. So those pieces of technology. And then the third meaning is the largest sense, sort of the entire collection of devices and engineering practices available to the culture, which are also dependent on scientific knowledge. So without scientific knowledge, you can't get to the technology part. And so then comes to the second letter, E, the nature of engineering. So in doing a search on engineering, I only could find something from 1997 from the National Academy of Engineering. And I don't think it's different from what Dr. Shelley talked about yesterday, if I remember correctly. So he talked about the E in STEM, and I think this still fits, so it might still be accurate. Engineers apply their knowledge in science and mathematics to design and create things, develop existing technology, and invent new methods and processes. So he gave an example yesterday of science notices, why is an apple rotten? And then the engineer says, how can we make apples not go rotten? So that's inventing a method or a process seems to still fit. So, like I mentioned, in Sarah, we got to visit like the Galata Tower, and we learned that this gentleman designed a way to fly from the Galata Tower. So, in my mind, it makes me think engineers are a little bit kooky, because why would you need to design a way to fly? I can say that because, again, my husband's an engineer, so they design things that can produce something not really for knowledge's sake, but because they want to solve a problem. Which brings us, and that reminds me of yesterday, I got to go to see Ephesus, and I feel like the visit to Ephesus had all of that STEM letters in there as well. So science, because the people who are excavating are using evidence to rebuild the city. Technology, because the people who lived in those days used technology to create amazing things, not technology like we have it now, but technology in their era, I couldn't even believe it. And then engineering, because they had to design, like even sewage systems and such. And then mathematics, because they were using proportion in building their buildings. And I remember seeing the library, it was pointed out to me that they built the lower pillars longer and the top floor pillars shorter to make it look like the building was taller. So it was very interesting to me to see that. And then, speaking of math, so I did look up for the nature of mathematics again, and I found in the Handbook of Research on Mathematics a very long chapter on what is the nature of mathematics. And this chapter was written by Hirsch in 1986. And I think there's more current things, but all I could find were things like Wikipedia and short things like that. So I believed that I would trust sort of the research and method stronger since it was easy to find. So this is what he stated, and I'm paraphrasing because it was a very long chapter. Mathematical objects are invented or created by humans, not arbitrarily, but arise from activity with already existing mathematical objects and from the needs of science in daily life. And once they're created, mathematical objects have properties that are well determined, that we may not find difficulty in discovering, but are possessed independently of our knowledge of them. So once we know math, then it exists, independent of us, 3 is 3 or whatever. Does anyone notice any difference from this slide versus my other slides? What's that? The I, yes. So yesterday, speaking of technology, yesterday I'm practicing my talk for today because I wanted to make sure I had everything going well and nice, and so I didn't look stupid up here. But I found out that I was missing my slide for the M, and it sort of stressed me out because I didn't bring the computer, and I knew I had the slide in an email, and then I said, what shall I do? And we sort of stumbled through the hallway up in front. My husband was with me, and we found the person who guided us on the Ephesus tour, and he very kindly let us use his computer, but it was sort of in the Turkish, is that correct? He was trying to teach it to us, and I'm a little slow on that, but he said we could change it into an I, but I said that it would be nice to show that technology works even at the last minute because it's a STEM conference. And also, friendship works too because he was very friendly, just very helpful to help us get that slide back in there. But all I was doing was trying to change the format, and somehow the slide left. But anyway, he was very happy and I was very grateful that he helped us. So anyway, thank you again, Ilker, if you're in here. I know you're not, but anyway. So now we're getting to the STEM, so the S in STEM, which is really what I'm supposed to be talking about. But I figured if I'm going to know about the S, I need to know the other letters too. In a brief way, not the same depth as STEM as the S, because I've been studying the S for 17 years. So what is the nature of science? That's the question now. According to the Next Generation Science Standards in the United States, then there are 8 different dimensions of the nature of science. And these, if anyone has studied the nature of science before, these are a little bit slight tweak from the ones that have been researched in the past, but not that different. But 4 of these practices or 4 of these nature of science aspects are found in the science and engineering practices, and then 4 are within the cross-cutting concepts. And so they're embedded within those 2 sections. So first, scientific investigations use a variety of different methods. Still in the U.S., you can go into a classroom and see the scientific method poster on the wall. Not in every classroom, but in many classrooms that's still up there. And we know that's not actually correct because many investigations are descriptive, correlational, and they don't fit the scientific method. So if you were a geologist or something, you don't necessarily use the scientific method. And then secondly, scientific knowledge is based on empirical evidence. So all scientific knowledge is at least partially based on observations of the natural world. So it has to be, there has to be evidence in order for it to be scientific. All theories and laws are checked against what actually occurs in the natural world. So if it doesn't occur in the natural world, it cannot be scientific. That doesn't mean it can't be real, but it's for science it needs to be evidence-based. Scientific knowledge is open to revision in light of new evidence. So all those textbooks that kids memorize can be changed if you have new evidence that you collect, or if you rethink existing evidence in a different way. So if someone else says something and it makes you rethink it, it could change what you think about that evidence. You could reinterpret that evidence. Scientific models, laws, mechanisms, and theories then explain natural phenomena. So, again, all of the scientific knowledge is supposed to describe the natural phenomena, laws will describe relationships among what you observe, and then the theories will be inferred explanation for what you observe. So there's, even in the US still, despite all the research, we still see the hierarchy of the laws, theories becoming laws if they get enough evidence, which is still not correct. Science is definitely one way of knowing. It is an evidence-based way of knowing. It is not the only way of knowing. It's not art, it's not philosophy, it's not history, it's not religion. It is one way of knowing. And that's, and again, connected to the attempt to explain natural phenomena. So, I think that's all I need to say. And then science also addresses questions about the natural and material world, which is connected to the previous one, is that it doesn't seek to answer questions outside the realm of the natural world, supernatural, religious questions. Those questions are important and acknowledged by science, but it doesn't mean they can be answered by science. So there's a role for science, and there's a role for other ways of knowing. Scientific knowledge also assumes an order and consistency in the natural system. So if you don't assume an order, then there's no reason to go out looking for patterns in your data. So you presume there's going to be an order in the natural world that you can then explain through collecting data and through interpreting your evidence. So this allows us to make predictions from our science and form generalizations that will then help us to explain the natural world. So one last one. Science is a human endeavor. So because we are people, it is subject to human interpretation and also human creativity, which is not a bad thing. But it can be biased by what we already know. So it's theory-laden. What we already know and what we see about the world influences how we interpret that data. So that's the subjective piece. And it's also socially and culturally embedded, meaning it might be different a bit depending on the culture or society that you come from. So now I'm going to go back to STEM. So if we're going to teach STEM as a discipline in itself, do we need to prepare teachers to understand the nature of these disciplines, the content in them as well as the connections among them? So, or are we just saying STEM is a thing? I know in the US that I think probably virtually zero, maybe more than that, but almost no teacher takes an engineering course, for instance. So I don't know how we're going to get them to be able to understand engineering in a way that's meaningful in order to be able to teach it in a way that's meaningful unless we adjust our coursework. And we are, at Indiana University, we don't have a STEM program right now. In fact, we have no engineering on campus except a brand new informatics, so they call us STEM, S-T-I-M, which is not even STEM. So, but we are going to try to implement a new course in the fall, and actually I'll be the instructor of it for doctoral students, to teach doctoral students and to explore about what the meaning of STEM is so that we can maybe be better at preparing teachers. So that's an aside, but in my mind, thinking about not being successful in the past and helping teachers better conceptualize just the nature of science, how can we help them understand the nature of all the disciplines, plus the connections among them and the content, and then teach these ideas to students? It's a big task. It seems a little bit depressing when I always think about it, but I'm always, the cheerleader and say, we can do it if anyone can do it, so we have to try to get there. So, and then thinking back on scientific literacy, which we talked about earlier, do we now focus on STEM literacy, or do we continue focusing on science literacy, or do we do both? And if so, what is STEM literacy? So in the same book by Roger Bybee that I talked about earlier, he did have a suggested version for what STEM literacy would be. And so it's these 4 things. I have 2 on each slide. The first one is a person will be STEM literate if they can demonstrate knowledge attitudes, and skills that enable them to identify questions and problems in life situations, and then explain the natural and design world, and then draw evidence-based conclusions about STEM-related issues. So that would be the first one. So that means they kind of know a little bit about the natural and design world, which that includes science and engineering, and then they can draw evidence-based conclusions. So again, being able to make decisions about. So it's kind of connected to scientific literacy there, but it adds the engineering piece. Then secondly, understanding the characteristic features of STEM disciplines as forms of human knowledge, inquiry, and design, which is also related to the nature of science because it's human knowledge. So that kind of connection we can maybe make. And then, but when you talk about the characteristic features, to me that's the nature of those disciplines. So if you're STEM literate, it makes me think that, at least through Roger Bivey's definition, we do need to talk about the nature of technology, nature of engineering, and the nature of mathematics with teachers who are going to be expected of teaching those to students. So they need to know those. And then help the students know those. It's a big task. I'm getting more depressed every time I say that. I shouldn't say that. We can do it. So thirdly, in order to be STEM literate, a person would need to have an awareness about how STEM disciplines shape our material, intellectual, and cultural environment. So how is STEM influencing the world that we live in, the world we navigate in, the world we go to work in, those things. And then also a willingness then to engage in STEM issues and with the ideas of science, technology, engineering, and math as a constructive, concerned, and reflective citizen. So then again, applying their knowledge to their lives and to decision making, which is related to science literacy, but it adds the technology, engineering, and mathematics in there. So I think that it's doable. It's a bigger task than only thinking about science, but it's still very related. But how do we get to STEM literacy? So that's the other thing. Like if we agree with Roger Bivey, and we agree on that definition, and we agree that we should target STEM literacy, how do we get there? So I went back to the definitions of the nature of the other letters. The nature of technology talked about being dependent on scientific knowledge, so you need to know science in order to design your technology. The nature of engineering, the engineers apply their knowledge in science, ... There was science in that one as well. The nature of mathematics, where they talked about it being created not arbitrarily, but arising from activity with already existing mathematical objects and from the needs of science. So science is within their definition as well. So it seems to me, and of course I'm theory laden because I think science is cool and that's why I came into science education, but it seems to me that all the other letters connect somehow to science. So it seems like the S in STEM is important. Maybe that's why it's not. It's the first letter. Just kidding. I don't know why it's the first letter. So anyway, did I do that? So it seems to me that the S is important. And of course, I would say that even if I didn't already do research through that, but I feel like it is important. And it causes me to think again that we need to, again, emphasize the nature of science because it's part of all the other letters. How can technology, engineering, and mathematics progress without an understanding of science, the content, and actually the kind of knowledge that science produces? How can they use that without understanding it? Science is part of each discipline's nature. And so it would be difficult for these disciplines to make progress without understanding the nature of scientific knowledge. And that doesn't mean science is better or worse or any of these. This is a different kind of knowledge. But it's an important kind of knowledge that relates to the other pieces. And so I think it's not only important for nature of science to be understood by those studying science, but also those studying the STEM disciplines. So it's part of all the STEM. And which makes me a little sad because we still haven't gotten to help teachers to understand the nature of science or implement it. So it's sort of hard, and that's why it makes me call for a renewed emphasis on nature of science, as well as STEM. So we could research not only nature of science, but how conceptualizing nature of science can influence conceptions of STEM. We could also study what really is STEM. What's the nature of STEM? And how is the nature of science related to that? So, and I also look for a definition of STEM itself, and there are very many definitions of STEM. In the same book by Roger Bybee, he's indicated there are so many definitions of STEM that no one agrees on that we can't really have a definition of STEM. But I think that our community as researchers, we can probably figure out what we mean by that and communicate with each other. And then we can maybe look for a way to define the nature of STEM. So the course that I'm teaching in the fall, we're going to be exploring that. What is the nature of STEM? How do we know when we are STEM, when we're doing STEM? Is it because we're designing something? Are we suddenly STEM? Or do we need to be making the connections explicit? Are there different STEMs? Are there little mini STEMs? Are there big STEMs? How do we know when STEM is STEM? Or when it's just a buzzword to get us funding? Just to be cynical a little bit. So again, I have a renewed call for the emphasis on STEM. I think that essence STEM really is that important. I think all the letters are important too, but of course, again, very latent. My view is science is important. I'm going to probably find this because I'm seeking it in an unbiased way, but I still think it's important. We do need to know about the nature of science as part of scientific literacy, but I also now argue that it's part of STEM literacy. And all the nature's other disciplines are part of STEM literacy. How do we know when we're doing technology, doing engineering, doing mathematics? If we're going to be STEM, we need to know what that means. So we saw that the past 40, 50 years of research on NOS didn't make much classroom impact. I think we need to work hard the next few years so we can make impact on classroom practice through STEM. So maybe that will be the key that helps us help teachers to help us help students. It's really hard to make classroom impact. I know that as researchers and university researchers, we can do our individual pieces and go into classrooms and work with teachers and organize, measure what students learn. It's hard to make broader impact, and I don't know how really to do that, especially since I remember when I was a new professor, you're also concerned about your own career and trying to get tenure and publish things and those kind of things. Somehow we need to figure out as a body, as a group, as a community, how to make impact on the policy as well and then help teachers. Because still, I think the part that's missing is the connection to the classroom, because we have a whole bunch of research, but how are we going to get it into the classroom, into the curriculum, so it's not as difficult for teachers to embed. So we need to get busy with our research, which I know we all are, because we're at a research conference right now presenting our research. And we also need to make an impact on practice. And that is, again, easier said than done, because, well, we already talked about that. It's hard to make the connections, hard to make the policy impact, and it's hard to do that. But we can do it. I live under that misconception until the day I retire. I think, so I planned for this to be about 45 minutes. I think I'm just about right. And then to have a discussion, because I thought maybe people from the audience might have some interesting questions or comments. Do I have the microphone?
No, it's not.
Oh, I see.
Okay.
Does anyone have a question? Go ahead. Okay, go ahead. Okay, something else.
The concept of STEM, is that just a money-making machinery? We're taking a concept, taking it to other cultures. This is quite a few discussions this morning. And it seems to me that we are taking, I live in the UK, So we're taking our Western concept to other cultures and kind of imposing it on them.
Right. Without research.
For our benefit, like we talk about, the need for job security, tenure and such like, rather than the well-being of those cultures within the context that is going to be most beneficial for them.
I tend to agree with you because I maybe it's because I'm old, but I've been through so many things. Okay, now we have this, now we have this, now we have this. And so it makes me wonder how we get these things, and that's why when I was reading the Roger Bybee book, when he was saying it could just be partly people sitting around thinking we need a new buzzword that can grab us our attention and grab us more money for projects, but it could just still be the same project. And yet we call it STEM now, and now it's cool and new, and so now we can get funding. So that's why I agree with you, because if we don't have research saying that we should be doing this, and that it's beneficial to students, and we have all kinds of other research that still hasn't been put into practice, then why do we need a new buzzword? But that's just my but, yeah.
Thank you.
I have one question. With the present, as you all know, politics does influence the research journals, right?
Right.
And when I was just in the US, there was President Bush was no child left behind that.
Right.
And after that, of course, with Obama administration, I believe STEM first appeared in his presidential report 1, and then the presidential report 2, both mentioned STEM, and I think you said there was no research behind it, and I think that this was the first president's choice. I wonder what's going to happen with the trans policy. Like, do you think they are going to push it forward, or it's going to lose its importance?
That's everybody wonders It's not
Any foresight?
probably not predictable. I do know that it's still being explored in at least our university in Indiana, that the importance of STEM. And we're even sticking in STEM since we don't have engineering. So I think it's still considered important. So it's not like it's gone. But I think it is, there's a call for, is this going to make an impact on students rather than, we need to be STEM or something like that. I think it's important. Like, I think part of our role as educators is to make sure that what we do does impact students. And so if we do the research that says that it is impactful to connect all those letters, then it might be more meaningful to them. I don't know. It doesn't mean it's going to influence politics. Since it never has in my experience before, but you get jaded when you get old, I guess.
Okay,
Q1 your presentation always like, okay, I have had several times in America, now in Turkey. Okay, actually I studied nature science for a number of years.
Yes.
So, and when the government, I'm from Hong Kong government started to invest much money to promote STEM, I feel a bit lost.
Right. Yeah.
The focus is different.
Yes, it is.
So can you give some suggestions? How can we seize the much might have been wasted to run STEM programs, and we can plan much later. Have you any ideas about how to combine the research of nature science and STEM and that?
Right. I don't mean to imply that I think that it's a waste of money to do STEM, but I don't know what's causing the STEM. But yes, my idea about talking about connecting the nature of science to STEM is to think about what's the nature of STEM and what's the role of nature of science within STEM. So that's how I'm thinking about my current research. Thinking about what's the nature of technology, engineering, and math. How how is nature of science connected to those, and then what's actually the nature of STEM. Since I did try to do a search again, what's the nature of STEM, and couldn't find anything. So I think that maybe you and I and others in this room who are interested in that could work on thinking about what's the nature of STEM, what's the meaning of quality STEM, not just say I have a STEM program, give me some money, but what's some meaningful STEM, what's the nature of meaningful STEM.
Okay, thank you for your speech, Dr. Akerson. As a talk of appreciation, you would like to present it to you. And I invite Professor Mustafa Pehlivan to be
Oh my goodness, how beautiful. Oh, thank you so much. So beautiful. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, our program is open. Thanks for coming. And tomorrow, for the personal statement, we will wait for you. Thanks.
Yes, we have to make some, you have to get it There's a way to do that. I think you said something. I have to write a letter saying why
Hatta bana bak. Biz bugünü bitirelim. Gel bir şey yapalım ya. Sanırım onlar gel.
Hocam bu HTML kafası var ama bu çalışır mı bilmiyorum yani. Yani bu burada var. Sizin saçlarınızda. Yani buradan eğer aktarıyorsa çekmiyor zaten.
I'm working with Dr. Moore. You know Dr.
I do.
Yeah, I'm working with her, and we are. She's focused on
Animasyon animasyon
I like the
Evet, evet. Ben şu an sunum yaptığımız yerde değilim. Siz sabahki sunumdan mı bahsedeceksiniz hocam? Ama o sunum geçti hocam. Biz sabah geldik, kimse gelmedi. Bir biz vardık. Bir de bir sunum yapacak daha şey vardı.
burada şeye bağlı. Animasyonda çalışıyorum. Aynı zamanda. Şeyden İşte o devam ediyor.
O zaman bilemedim.
Oh, that's why.
Yeah.
So that's your time.
Biz de çünkü sunum yapamadık sabah.